Chapter 7 of Dream Psychology. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Dream Psychology by Sigmund Freud. Translated by M. D. Eder. Chapter 7. The Function of the Dream. Since we know that the foreconscious is suspended during the night by the wish to sleep, we can proceed to an intelligent investigation of the dream process. But let us first sum up the knowledge of this process already gained. We have shown that the waking activity leaves day remnants from which the sum of energy cannot be entirely removed. Or the waking activity revives during the day one of the unconscious wishes, or both conditions occur simultaneously. We have already discovered the many variations that may take place. The unconscious wish has already made its way to the day remnants, either during the day, or at any rate with the beginning of sleep, and has effected a transference to it. This produces a wish transferred to the recent material, or the suppressed recent wish comes to life again through a reinforcement from the unconscious. This wish now endeavors to make its way to consciousness on the normal path of the mental processes through the foreconscious, to which indeed it belongs through one of its constituent elements. It is confronted, however, by the censor, which is still active, and to the influence of which it now succumbs. It now takes on the distortion for which the way has already been paved by its transference to the recent material. Thus far, it is in the way of becoming something resembling an obsession, delusion, or the like, i.e., a thought reinforced by a transference and distorted in expression by the censor, but its further progress is now checked through the dormant state of the foreconscious. This system has apparently protected itself against invasion by diminishing its excitements. The dream process, therefore, takes the regressive course, which has just been opened by the peculiarity of the sleeping state, and thereby follows the attraction exerted on it by the memory groups, which themselves exist in part only as visual energy not yet translated into terms of the later systems. On its way to regression, the dream takes on the form of dramatization. The subject of compression will be discussed later. The dream process has now terminated the second part of its repeatedly impeded course. The first part expended itself progressively from the unconscious scenes or fantasies to the foreconscious, while the second part gravitates from the advent of the censor back to the perceptions. But when the dream process becomes a content of perception, it has, so to speak, eluded the obstacle set up in the foreconscious by the censor and by the sleeping state. It succeeds in drawing attention to itself and in being noticed by consciousness. For consciousness, which means to us a sensory organ for the reception of psychic qualities, may receive stimuli from two sources. First, from the periphery of the entire apparatus, viz., from the perception system, and secondly, from the pleasure and pain stimuli, which constitute the sole psychic quality produced in the transformation of energy within the apparatus. All other processes in the system, even those in the foreconscious, are devoid of any psychic quality, and are therefore not objects of consciousness inasmuch as they do not furnish pleasure or pain for perception. We shall have to assume that those liberations of pleasure and pain automatically regulate the outlet of the occupation processes. But in order to make possible more delicate functions, it was later found necessary to render the course of the presentations more independent of the manifestations of pain. To accomplish this, the foreconscious system needed some qualities of its own which could attract consciousness, and most probably received them through the connection of the foreconscious processes with the memory system of the signs of speech, which is not devoid of qualities. Through the qualities of this system, consciousness, which had hitherto been a sensory organ only for the perceptions, now becomes also a sensory organ for a part of our mental processes. Thus we have now, as it were, two sensory surfaces, one directed to perceptions and the other to the foreconscious mental processes. I must assume that the sensory surface of consciousness devoted to the foreconscious is rendered less excitable by sleep than that directed to the P systems. The giving up of interest for the nocturnal mental processes is indeed purposeful. Nothing is to disturb the mind. The foreconscious wants to sleep. But once the dream becomes a perception, it is then capable of exciting consciousness through the qualities thus gained. The sensory stimulus accomplishes what it was really destined for, namely, it directs a part of the energy at the disposal of the foreconscious in the form of attention upon the stimulant. We must therefore admit that the dream invariably awakens us. That is, it puts into activity a part of the dormant force of the foreconscious. This force imparts to the dream that influence which we have designated as secondary elaboration for the sake of connection and comprehensibility. This means that the dream is treated by it like any other content of perception. It is subjected to the same ideas of expectation, as far at least as the material admits. As far as the direction is concerned in this third part of the dream, it may be said that here again the movement is progressive. To avoid misunderstanding, it will not be amiss to say a few words about the temporal peculiarities of these dream processes. In a very interesting discussion, apparently suggested by Maury's puzzling guillotine dream, Goblet tries to demonstrate that the dream requires no other time than the transition period between sleeping and wakening. The wakening requires time, as the dream takes place during that period. One is inclined to believe that the final picture of the dream is so strong that it forces the dreamer to awaken, but, as a matter of fact, this picture is strong only because the dreamer is already very near awakening when it appears. Un rêve, c'est un réveil qui commence. It has already been emphasized by Dugas that Goblet was forced to repudiate many facts in order to generalize his theory. There are, moreover, dreams from which we do not awaken, e.g., some dreams in which we dream that we dream. From our knowledge of the dream work, we can by no means admit that it extends only over the period of awakening. On the contrary, we must consider it probable that the first part of the dream work begins during the day when we are still under the domination of the foreconscious. The second phase of the dream work, viz. The modification through the censor, the attraction by the unconscious scenes, and the penetration to perception, must continue throughout the night. And we are probably always right when we assert that we feel as though we had been dreaming the whole night, although we cannot say what. I do not, however, think it necessary to assume that, up to the time of becoming conscious, the dream processes really follow the temporal sequence which we have described, viz. That there is first the transferred dream wish, then the distortion of the censor, and consequently the change of direction to regression, and so on. We were forced to form such a succession for the sake of description. In reality, however, it is much rather a matter of simultaneously trying this path and that, and of emotions fluctuating to and fro, until finally, owing to the most expedient distribution, one particular grouping is secured which remains. From certain personal experiences, I am myself inclined to believe that the dream work often requires more than one day and one night to produce its result. If this be true, the extraordinary art manifested in the construction of the dream loses all its marvels. In my opinion, even the regard for comprehensibility as an occurrence of perception may take effect before the dream attracts consciousness to itself. To be sure, from now on the process is accelerated, as the dream is henceforth subjected to the same treatment as any other perception. It is like fireworks, which require hours of preparation and only a moment for ignition. Through the dream work, the dream process now gains either sufficient intensity to attract consciousness to itself and arouse the foreconscious, which is quite independent of the time or profundity of sleep, or, its intensity being insufficient, it must wait until it meets the attention which is set in motion immediately before awakening. Most dreams seem to operate with relatively slight psychic intensities, for they wait for the awakening. This, however, explains the fact that we regularly perceive something dreamt on being suddenly aroused from a sound sleep. Here, as well as in spontaneous awakening, the first glance strikes the perception content created by the dream work while the next strikes the one produced from without. But of greater theoretical interest are those dreams which are capable of waking us in the midst of sleep. We must bear in mind the expediency elsewhere universally demonstrated, and ask ourselves why the dream or the unconscious wish has the power to disturb sleep, i.e., the fulfillment of the foreconscious wish. This is probably due to certain relations of energy into which we have no insight. If we possess such insight, we should probably find that the freedom given to the dream and the expenditure of a certain amount of detached attention represent for the dream an economy in energy, keeping in view the fact that the unconscious must be kept in check at night just as during the day. We know from experience that the dream, even if it interrupts sleep repeatedly during the same night, still remains compatible with sleep. We wake up for an instant, and immediately resume our sleep. It is like driving off a fly during sleep. We awake ad hoc, and when we resume our sleep, we have removed the disturbance. As demonstrated by familiar examples from the sleep of wet nurses, etc., the fulfillment of the wish to sleep is quite compatible with the retention of a certain amount of attention in a given direction. But we must here take cognizance of an objection that is based on a better knowledge of the unconscious processes. Although we have ourselves described the unconscious wishes as always active, we have, nevertheless, asserted that they are not sufficiently strong during the day to make themselves perceptible. But when we sleep, and the unconscious wish has shown its power to form a dream, and with it to awaken the foreconscious, why, then, does this power become exhausted after the dream has been taken cognizance of? Would it not seem more probable that the dream should continually renew itself, like the troublesome fly, which, when driven away, takes pleasure in returning again and again? What justifies our assertion that the dream removes the disturbance of sleep? That the unconscious wishes always remain active is quite true. They represent paths which are passable whenever a sum of excitement makes use of them. Moreover, a remarkable peculiarity of the unconscious processes is the fact that they remain indestructible. Nothing can be brought to an end in the unconscious. Nothing can cease or be forgotten. This impression is most strongly gained in the study of the neuroses, especially of hysteria. The unconscious stream of thought which leads to the discharge through an attack becomes passable again as soon as there is an accumulation of a sufficient amount of excitement. The mortification brought on 30 years ago, after having gained access to the unconscious affective source, operates during all these 30 years like a recent one. Whenever its memory is touched, it is revived and shows itself to be supplied with the excitement which is discharged in a motor attack. It is just here that the office of psychotherapy begins, its task being to bring about adjustment and forgetfulness for the unconscious processes. Indeed, the fading of memories and the flagging of effects, which we are apt to take as self-evident and to explain as a primary influence of time on the psychic memories, are in reality secondary changes brought about by painstaking work. It is the foreconscious that accomplishes this work, and the only course to be pursued by psychotherapy is the subjugate of the unconscious to the domination of the foreconscious. There are, therefore, two exits for the individual unconscious emotional process. It is either left to itself, in which case it ultimately breaks through somewhere and secures for once a discharge for its excitation into motility, or it succumbs to the influence of the foreconscious, and its excitation becomes confined through this influence instead of being discharged. It is the latter process that occurs in the dream. Owing to the fact that it is directed by the conscious excitement, the energy from the foreconscious, which confronts the dream when grown to perception, restricts the unconscious excitement of the dream and renders it harmless as a disturbing factor. When the dreamer wakes up for a moment, he has actually chased away the fly that has threatened to disturb his sleep. We can now understand that it is really more expedient and economical to give full sway to the unconscious wish, and clear its way to regression so that it may form a dream, and then restrict and adjust this dream by means of a small expenditure of foreconscious labor, than to curb the unconscious thought the entire period of sleep. We should, indeed, expect that the dream, even if it was not originally an expedient process, would have acquired some function in the play of forces of the psychic life. We now see what this function is. The dream has taken it upon itself to bring the liberated excitement of the unconscious back under the domination of the foreconscious. It thus affords relief for the excitement of the unconscious and acts as a safety valve for the latter, and at the same time it ensures the sleep of the foreconscious at a slight expenditure of the waking state. Like the other psychic formations of its group, the dream offers itself as a compromise serving simultaneously both systems by fulfilling both wishes insofar as they are compatible with each other. A glance at Robert's elimination theory will show that we must agree with this author in his main point, viz. In the determination of the function of the dream, though we differ from him in our hypotheses and in our treatment of the dream process. The above qualification, insofar as the two wishes are compatible with each other, contains the suggestion that there may be cases in which the function of the dream suffers shipwreck. The dream process is in the first instance admitted as a wish fulfillment of the unconscious. But if this tentative wish fulfillment disturbs the foreconscious to such an extent that the latter can no longer maintain its rest, the dream then breaks the compromise and fails to perform the second part of its task. It is then at once broken off and replaced by complete wakefulness. Here, too, it is not really the fault of the dream if, while ordinarily the guardian of sleep, it is here compelled to appear as the disturber of sleep, nor should this cause us to entertain any doubts as to its efficacy. This is not the only case in the organism in which an otherwise efficacious arrangement becomes inefficacious and disturbing as soon as some element is changed in the conditions of its origin. The disturbance then serves at least the new purpose of announcing the change, and calling into play against it the means of adjustment of the organism. In this connection, I naturally bear in mind the case of the anxiety dream, and in order not to have the appearance of trying to exclude this testimony against the theory of wish fulfillment wherever I encounter it, I will attempt an explanation of the anxiety dream, at least offering some suggestions. That a psychic process developing anxiety may still be a wish fulfillment has long ceased to impress us as a contradiction. We may explain this occurrence by the fact that the wish belongs to one system, the unconscious, while by the other system, the foreconscious, this wish has been rejected and suppressed. The subjection of the unconscious by the foreconscious is not complete even in perfect psychic health. The amount of this suppression shows the degree of our psychic normality. Neurotic symptoms show that there is a conflict between the two systems. The symptoms are the results of a compromise of this conflict, and they temporarily put an end to it. On the one hand, they afford the unconscious an outlet for the discharge of its excitement and serve it as a sally port, while, on the other hand, they give the foreconscious the capability of dominating the unconscious, to some extent. It is highly instructive to consider, e.g., the significance of any hysterical phobia or of an agoraphobia. Suppose a neurotic incapable of crossing the street alone, which we would justly call a symptom. We attempt to remove this symptom by urging him to the action which he deems himself incapable of. The result will be an attack of anxiety, just as an attack of anxiety in the street has often been the cause of establishing an agoraphobia. We thus learn that the symptom has been constituted in order to guard against the outbreak of the anxiety. The phobia is thrown before the anxiety like a fortress on the frontier. Unless we enter into the part played by the effects in these processes, which can be done here only imperfectly, we cannot continue our discussion. Let us therefore advance the proposition that the reason why the suppression of the unconscious becomes absolutely necessary is because, if the discharge of the presentation should be left to itself, it would develop an effect in the unconscious which originally bore the character of pleasure, but which, since the appearance of the repression, bears the character of pain. The aim, as well as the result, of the suppression is to stop the development of this pain. The suppression extends over the unconscious ideation because the liberation of pain might emanate from the ideation. The foundation is here laid for a very definite assumption concerning the nature of the affective development. It is regarded as a motor or secondary activity, the key to the innervation of which is located in the presentations of the unconscious. Through the domination of the foreconscious, these presentations become, as it were, throttled and inhibited at the exit of the emotion-developing impulses. The danger, which is due to the fact that the foreconscious ceases to occupy the energy, therefore consists in the fact that the unconscious excitations liberate such an effect as, in consequence of the repression that has previously taken place, can only be perceived as pain or anxiety. This danger is released through the full sway of the dream process. The determinations for its realization consist in the fact that repressions have taken place, and that the suppressed emotional wishes shall become sufficiently strong. They thus stand entirely without the psychological realm of the dream structure. Were it not for the fact that our subject is connected through just one factor, namely, the freeing of the unconscious during sleep, with the subject of the development of anxiety, I could dispense with discussion of the anxiety dream, and thus avoid all obscurities connected with it. As I have often repeated, the theory of the anxiety belongs to the psychology of the neuroses. I would say that the anxiety in the dream is an anxiety problem and not a dream problem. We have nothing further to do with it after having once demonstrated its point of contact with the subject of the dream process. There is only one thing left for me to do. As I have asserted that the neurotic anxiety originates from sexual sources, I can subject anxiety dreams to analysis in order to demonstrate the sexual material in their dream thoughts. For good reasons, I refrain from citing here any of the numerous examples placed at my disposal by neurotic patients, but prefer to give anxiety dreams from young persons. Personally, I have had no real anxiety dream for decades, but I recall one from my 7th or 8th year, which I subjected to interpretation about 30 years later. The dream was very vivid, and showed me, my beloved mother, with peculiarly calm sleeping countenance, carried into the room and laid on the bed by 2 or 3 persons with birds' beaks. I awoke crying and screaming, and disturbed my parents. The very tall figures, draped in a peculiar manner, with beaks, I had taken from the illustrations of Philippson's Bible. I believe they represented deities with heads of sparrowhawks from an Egyptian tomb relief. The analysis also introduced the reminiscence of a naughty janitor's boy, who used to play with us children on the meadow in front of the house. I would add that his name was Philip. I feel that I first heard from this boy the vulgar word signifying sexual intercourse, which is replaced among the educated by the Latin coitus, but to which the dream distinctively alludes by the selection of the birds' heads. I must have suspected the sexual significance of the word from the facial expression of my worldly wise teacher. My mother's features in the dream were copied from the countenance of my grandfather, whom I had seen a few days before his death snoring in the state of coma. The interpretation of the secondary elaboration in the dream must therefore have been that my mother was dying. The tomb relief, too, agrees with this. In this anxiety I awoke, and could not calm myself until I had awakened my parents. I remember that I suddenly became calm on coming face to face with my mother, as if I needed the assurance that my mother was not dead. But this secondary interpretation of the dream had been effected only under the influence of the developed anxiety. I was not frightened because I dreamed that my mother was dying, but I interpreted the dream in this manner, in the foreconscious elaboration, because I was already under the domination of the anxiety. The latter, however, could be traced by the means of the repression to an obscure, obviously sexual desire, which had found its satisfying expression in the visual content of the dream. A man 27 years old, who had been severely ill for a year, had had many terrifying dreams between the ages of 11 and 13. He thought that a man with an axe was running after him. He wished to run, but felt paralyzed and could not move from the spot. This may be taken as a good example of a very common and apparently sexually indifferent anxiety dream. In the analysis, the dreamer first thought of a story told him by his uncle, which chronologically was later than the dream, viz. that he was attacked at night by a suspicious-looking individual. This occurrence led him to believe that he himself might have already heard of a similar episode at the time of the dream. In connection with the axe, he recalled that during that period of his life he once hurt his hand with an axe while chopping wood. This immediately led to his relations with his younger brother, whom he used to maltreat and knock down. In particular, he recalled an occasion when he struck his brother on the head with his boot until he bled, whereupon his mother remarked, "I fear he will kill him some day." While he was seemingly thinking of the subject of violence, a reminiscence from his 9th year suddenly occurred to him. His parents came home late and went to bed while he was feigning sleep. He soon heard panting and other noises that appeared strange to him, and he could also make out the position of his parents in bed. His further associations showed that he had established an analogy between this relation between his parents and his own relation toward his younger brother. He subsumed what occurred between his parents under the conception violence and wrestling, and thus reached a sadistic conception of the coitus act, as often happens among children. The fact that he often noticed blood on his mother's bed corroborated his conception. That the sexual intercourse of adults appears strange to children who observe it, and arouses fear in them, I dare say is a fact of daily experience. I have explained this fear by the fact that sexual excitement is not mastered by their understanding, and is probably also inacceptable to them because their parents are involved in it. For the same son, this excitement is converted into fear. At a still earlier period of life, sexual emotion directed toward the parent of opposite sex does not meet with repression, but finds free expression, as we have seen before. For the night terrors with hallucinations, pavor nocturnus, frequently found in children, I would unhesitatingly give the same explanation. Here, too, we are certainly dealing with the incomprehensible and rejected sexual feelings, which, if noted, would probably show a temporal periodicity for an enhancement of the sexual libido, may just as well be produced accidentally through emotional impressions as through the spontaneous and gradual processes of development. I lacked the necessary material to sustain these explanations from observation. On the one hand, the pediatrists seem to lack the point of view which alone makes comprehensible the whole series of phenomena, on the somatic as well as on the psychic side. To illustrate by a comical example how one wearing the blinders of medical mythology may miss the understanding of such cases, I will relate a case which I found in a thesis on pavor nocturnus by de Backer, 1881. A 13-year-old boy of delicate health began to become anxious and dreamy. His sleep became restless, and about once a week it was interrupted by an acute attack of anxiety with hallucinations. The memory of these dreams was invariably very distinct. Thus he related that the devil shouted at him, "Now we have you, now we have you." And this was followed by an odor of sulfur. The fire burned his skin. This dream aroused him, terror-stricken. He was unable to scream at first. Then his voice returned, and he was heard to say distinctly, "No, no, not me. Why, I have done nothing," or, "Please don't, I shall never do it again." Occasionally, also, he said, "Albert has not done that." Later, he avoided undressing, because, as he said, the fire attacked him only when he was undressed. From amid these evil dreams, which menaced his health, he was sent into the country, where he recovered within a year and a half, but at the age of 15 he once confessed, "Je ne sais pas le vieux, mais j'éprouvais continuellement les picotements et des surexcisions au parti. À la fin, cela m'énervait tant que plusieurs fois, je pense me jeter par la fenêtre au dortoir." It is certainly not difficult to suspect, 1. That the boy had practiced masturbation in former years, that he probably denied it, and was threatened with severe punishment for his wrongdoing. His confession, "Je ne le ferai plus," his denial, "Albert n'a jamais fait ça." 2. That under the pressure of puberty the temptation to self-abuse through the tickling of the genitals was reawakened. 3. That now, however, a struggle of repression arose in him, suppressing the libido and changing it into fear, which subsequently took the form of the punishments with which he was then threatened. Let us, however, quote the conclusions drawn by our author. This observation shows 1. That the influence of puberty may produce in a boy of delicate health a condition of extreme weakness, and that it may lead to a very marked cerebral anemia. 2. This cerebral anemia produces a transformation of character, demonomaniacal hallucinations, and very violent nocturnal, perhaps also diurnal, states of anxiety. 3. Demonomania and the self-reproaches of the day can be traced to the influences of religious education which the subject underwent as a child. 4. All manifestations disappeared as a result of a lengthy sojourn in the country, bodily exercise, and the return of physical strength after the termination of the period of puberty. 5. A predisposing influence for the origin of the cerebral condition of the boy may be attributed to heredity and to the father's chronic syphilitic state. The concluding remarks of the author read, Nous avons fait entrer cette observation dans le cadre des délires épileptiques domination, car c'est à l'ischémie cérébrale que nous rattachons ces états particuliers. End of chapter 7.
Chapter 8 of Dream Psychology. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by M.L. Cohen, Cleveland, Ohio, March 2007. Dream Psychology by Sigmund Freud, translated by M.D. Eder, Section 8. The primary and secondary process. Regression. In venturing to attempt to penetrate more deeply into the psychology of the dream processes, I have undertaken a difficult task, to which indeed my power of description is hardly equal. To reproduce in description by a succession of words the simultaneousness of so complex a chain of events, and in doing so to appear unbiased throughout the exposition, goes fairly beyond my powers. I have now to atone for the fact that I have been unable in my description of the dream psychology to follow the historic development of my views. The viewpoints for my conception of the dream were reached through earlier investigations in the psychology of the neuroses, to which I am not supposed to refer here, but to which I am repeatedly forced to refer. Whereas, I should prefer to proceed in the opposite direction, and starting from the dream, to establish a connection with the psychology of the neuroses. I am well aware of all the inconveniences arising for the reader from this difficulty, but I know of no way to avoid them. As I am dissatisfied with the state of affairs, I am glad to dwell upon another viewpoint which seems to raise the value of my efforts. As have been shown in the introduction to the first chapter, I found myself confronted with a theme which had been marked by the sharpest contradictions on the part of authorities. After our elaboration of the dream problems, we found room for most of these contradictions. We have been forced, however, to take a decided exception to two of the views pronounced, that is, that the dream is a senseless and that it is a somatic process. Apart from these cases, we have had to accept all the contradictory views in one place or another of the complicated argument, and we have been able to demonstrate that they had discovered something that was correct. That the dream continues the impulses and interests of the waking state has been quite generally confirmed through the discovery of the latent thoughts of the dream. These thoughts concern themselves only with things that seem important and of momentous interest to us. The dream never occupies itself with trifles. But we have also concurred with the contrary view, that is, that the dream gathers up the indifferent remnants of the day, and that not until it has in some measure withdrawn itself from the waking activity can an important event of the day be taken up by the dream. We found this holding true for the dream content, which gives the dream thought its changed expression by means of disfigurement. We have said that from the nature of the association mechanism, the dream process more easily takes possession of recent or indifferent material which has not yet been seized by the waking mental activity, and by reason of the censor, it transfers the psychic intensity from the important but also disagreeable to the indifferent material. The hypermnesia of the dream and the resort to infantile material have become main supports in our theory. In our theory of the dream, we have attributed to the wish originating from the infantile the part of an indispensable motor for the formation of the dream. We naturally could not think of doubting the experimentally demonstrated significance of the objective sensory stimuli during sleep, but we have brought this material into the same relation to the dream wish as the thought remnants from the waking activity. There was no need of disputing the fact that the dream interprets objective sensory stimuli after the manner of an illusion, but we have supplied the motive for this interpretation which has been left undecided by the authorities. The interpretation follows in such a manner that the perceived object is rendered harmless as a sleep disturber and becomes available for the wish fulfillment. Though we do not admit as special sources of the dream the subjective state of excitement of the sensory organs during sleep, which seems to have been demonstrated by Trumbull Ladd, we are nevertheless able to explain this excitement through the regressive revival of active memories behind the dream. A modest part in our conception has also been assigned to the inner organic sensations, which are wont to be taken as the cardinal point in the explanation of the dream. These, the sensation of falling, flying, or inhibition, stand as an ever-ready material to be used by the dream work to express the dream thought as often as need arises. That the dream process is a rapid and momentary one seems to be true for the perception through consciousness of the already prepared dream content. The preceding parts of the dream process probably take a slow, fluctuating course. We have solved the riddle of the superabundant dream content compressed within the briefest moment by explaining that it is due to the appropriation of almost fully formed structures from the psychic life. That the dream is disfigured and distorted by memory we found to be correct, but not troublesome, as this is only the last manifest operation in the work of disfigurement, which has been active from the beginning of the dream work. In the bitter and seemingly irreconcilable controversy as to whether the psychic life sleeps at night, or can make the same use of all its capabilities as during the day, we have been able to agree with both sides, though not fully with either. We have found proof that the dream thoughts represent a most complicated intellectual activity, employing almost every means furnished by the psychic apparatus. Still, it cannot be denied that the dream thoughts originated during the day, and it is indispensable to assume that there is a sleeping state of the psychic life. Thus, even the theory of partial sleep has come into play, but the characteristics of the sleeping state have been found not in the dilapidation of the psychic connections, but in the cessation of the psychic system dominating the day, arising from its desire to sleep. The withdrawal from the outer world retains its significance also for our conception. Though not the only factor, it nevertheless helps the regression to make possible the representation of the dream. That we should reject the voluntary guidance of the presentation course is uncontestable, but the psychic life does not thereby become aimless, for we have seen that after the abandonment of the desired and presentation undesired ones gain mastery. The loose associative connection in the dream we have not only recognized, but we have placed under its control a far greater territory than could have been supposed. We have, however, found it merely the feigned substitute for another correct and sensible one. To be sure, we too have called the dream absurd, but we have been able to learn from examples how wise the dream really is when it simulates absurdity. We do not deny any of the functions that have been attributed to the dream, that the dream relieves the mind like a valve, and that according to Robert's assertion all kinds of harmful material are rendered harmless through representation in the dream, not only exactly corresponds with our theory of the twofold wish fulfillment in the dream, but, in his own wording, becomes even more comprehensible for us than for Robert himself. The free indulgence of the psychic in the play of its faculties finds expression with us in the non-interference with the dream on the part of the foreconscious activity. The return to the embryonal state of the psychic life in the dream, and the observation of Havelock Ellis, an archaic world of vast emotions and imperfect thoughts, appear to us as happy anticipations of our deductions to the effect that primitive modes of work suppressed during the day participate in the formation of the dream, and with us, as with Delage, the suppressed material becomes the mainspring of the dreaming. We have fully recognized the role which Scherner ascribes to the dream fantasy, and even its interpretation, but we have been obliged, so to speak, to conduct them to another department in the problem. It is not the dream that produces the fantasy, but the unconscious fantasy that takes the greater part in the formation of dream thoughts. We are indebted to Scherner for his clue to the source of the dream thoughts, but almost everything that he ascribes to the dream work is attributable to the activity of the unconscious, which is at work during the day, and which supplies incitements not only for dreams, but for neurotic symptoms as well. We have had to separate the dream work from this activity as being something entirely different and far more restricted. Finally, we have by no means abandoned the relation of the dream to mental disturbances, but, on the contrary, we have given it a more solid foundation on new ground. Thus held together by the new material of our theory as by a superior unity, we find the most varied and most contradictory conclusions of the authorities fitting into our structure. Some of them are differently disposed, only a few of them are entirely rejected. But our own structure is still unfinished. For, disregarding the many obscurities which we have necessarily encountered in our advance into the darkness of psychology, we are now apparently embarrassed by a new contradiction. On the one hand, we have allowed the dream thoughts to proceed from perfectly normal mental operations, while, on the other hand, we have found among the dream thoughts a number of entirely abnormal mental processes, which extend likewise to the dream contents. These, consequently, we have repeated in the interpretation of the dream. All that we have termed the dream work seems so remote from the psychic processes recognized by us as correct, that the severest judgment of the authors as to the low psychic activity of dreaming seems to us well founded. Perhaps only through still further advance can enlightenment and improvement be brought about. I shall pick out one of the constellations leading to the formation of dreams. We have learned that the dream replaces a number of thoughts derived from daily life which are perfectly formed logically. We cannot therefore doubt that these thoughts originate from our normal mental life. All the qualities which we esteem in our mental operations, and which distinguish these as complicated activities of a high order, we find repeated in the dream thoughts. There is, however, no need of assuming that this mental work is performed during sleep, as this would materially impair the conception of the psychic state of sleep we have hitherto adhered to. These thoughts may just as well have originated from the day, and, unnoticed by our consciousness from their inception, they may have continued to develop until they stood complete at the onset of sleep. If we are to conclude anything from this state of affairs, it will at most prove that the most complex mental operations are possible without the cooperation of consciousness, which we have already learned independently from every psychoanalysis of persons suffering from hysteria or obsessions. These dream thoughts are in themselves surely not incapable of consciousness. If they have not become conscious to us during the day, this may have various reasons. The state of becoming conscious depends on the exercise of a certain psychic function, that is, attention, which seems to be extended only in a definite quantity, and which may have been withdrawn from the stream of thought in question by other aims. Another way in which such mental streams are kept from consciousness is the following. Our conscious reflection teaches us that when exercising attention, we pursue a definite course. But if that course leads us to an idea which does not hold its own with the critic, we discontinue and cease to apply our attention. Now, apparently, The stream of thought thus started and abandoned may spin on without regaining attention, unless it reaches a spot of especially marked intensity, which forces the return of attention. An initial rejection, perhaps consciously brought about by the judgment on the ground of incorrectness or unfitness for actual purpose of the mental act, may therefore account for the fact that a mental process continues until the onset of sleep unnoticed by consciousness. Let us recapitulate by saying that we call such a stream of thought a foreconscious one, that we believe it to be perfectly correct, and that it may just as well be a more neglected one or an interrupted and suppressed one. Let us also state frankly in what manner we conceive this presentation course. We believe that a certain sum of excitement, which we call occupation energy, is displaced from an end presentation along the association path selected by that end presentation. A "neglected" stream of thought has received no such occupation, and from a "suppressed" or "rejected" one, this occupation has been withdrawn. Both have thus been left to their own emotions. The end stream of thought stocked with energy is under certain conditions able to draw to itself the attention of consciousness, through which means it then receives a "surplus of energy." We shall be obliged somewhat later to elucidate our assumption concerning the nature and activity of consciousness. A train of thought thus incited in the foreconscious may either disappear spontaneously or continue. The former issue we conceive as follows. It diffuses its energy through all the association paths emanating from it, and throws the entire chain of ideas into a state of excitement which, after lasting for a while, subsides through transformation of the excitement requiring an outlet into dormant energy. Footnote. Cf. The Significant Observations by J. Boyer in our Studies on Hysteria, 1895, and second edition, 1909. End footnote. If this first issue is brought about, the process has no further significance for the dream formation. But other end presentations are lurking in our foreconscious that originate from the sources of our unconscious and from the ever-active wishes. These may take possession of the excitations in the circle of thought thus left to itself, establish a connection between it and the unconscious wish, and transfer to it the energy inherent in the unconscious wish. Henceforth, the neglected or suppressed train of thought is in a position to maintain itself, although this reinforcement does not help it to gain access to consciousness. We may say that the hitherto foreconscious train of thought has been drawn into the unconscious. Other consolation for the dream formation would result in the foreconscious train of thought had from the beginning been connected with the unconscious wish, and for that reason met with rejection by the dominating end occupation, or if an unconscious wish were made active for other, possibly somatic reasons, and of its own accord sought a transference to the psychic remnants not occupied by the foreconscious, all three cases finally combine in one issue, so that there is established in the foreconscious a stream of thought which, having been abandoned by the foreconscious occupation, receives occupation from the unconscious wish. The stream of thought is henceforth subjected to a series of transformations which we no longer recognize as normal psychic processes, and which gives us a surprising result, that is, a psychopathological formation. Let us emphasize and group the same. 1. The intensities of the individual ideas become capable of discharge in their entirety, and, proceeding from one conception to the other, they thus form single presentations endowed with marked intensity. Through the repeated recurrence of this process, the intensity of an entire train of ideas may ultimately be gathered into a single presentation element. This is the principle of compression or condensation. It is condensation that is mainly responsible for the strange impression of the dream, for we know nothing analogous to it in the normal psychic life accessible to consciousness. We find here also presentations which possess great psychic significance as junctions or as end results of whole chains of thought. But this validity does not manifest itself in any character conspicuous enough for the internal perception, Hence, what has been presented in it does not become in any way more intensive. In the process of condensation, the entire psychic connection becomes transformed into the intensity of the presentation content. It is the same as in a book where we space or print in heavy type any word upon which particular stress is laid for the understanding of the text. In speech, the same word would be pronounced loudly and deliberately and with emphasis. The first comparison leads us at once to an example taken from the chapter on the dream work (trimethylamine in the dream of Irma's injection). Historians of art call our attention to the fact that the most ancient historical sculptures follow a simple principle in expressing the rank of the persons represented by the size of the statue. The king is made 2 or 3 times as large as his retinue or the vanquished enemy. A piece of art, however, from the Roman period, makes use of more subtle means to accomplish the same purpose. The figure of the emperor is placed in the center in a firmly erect posture. Special care is bestowed upon the proper modeling of his figures. His enemies are seen cowering at his feet, but he is no longer represented a giant among dwarfs. However, the bowing of the subordinate to a superior in our days is only an echo of that ancient principle of representation. The direction taken by the condensations of the dream is prescribed on the one hand by the true foreconscious relations of the dream thoughts, on the other hand by the attraction of the visual reminiscences of the unconscious. The success of the condensation work produces those intensities which are required for penetration into the perception systems. 2. Through this free transferability of the intensities, moreover, and in the service of condensation, intermediary presentations, compromises as it were, are formed. Cf. the numerous examples. This likewise is something unheard of in the normal presentation course, where it is above all a question of selection and retention of the proper presentation element. On the other hand, composite and compromise formations occur with extraordinary frequency when we are trying to find the linguistic expression for the foreconscious thoughts. These are considered "slips of the tongue." 3. The presentations which transfer their intensities to one another are very loosely connected, and are joined together by such forms of association as are spurned in our serious thought and are utilized in the production of the effect of wit only. Among these we particularly find associations of the sound and consonance types. 4. Contradictory thoughts do not strive to eliminate one another, but remain side by side. They often unite to produce condensation as if no contradiction existed. Or they form compromises for which we should never forgive our thoughts, but which we frequently approve of in our actions. These are some of the most conspicuous abnormal processes to which the thoughts which have been previously rationally formed are subjected in the course of the dream work. As the main feature of these processes, we recognize the high importance attached to the fact of rendering the occupation energy mobile and capable of discharge. The content and the actual significance of the psychic elements to which these energies adhere becomes a matter of secondary importance. One might possibly think that the condensation and compromise formation is effected only in the service of regression, when occasion arises for changing thoughts in the pictures. But the analysis and, still more distinctly, the synthesis of dreams which lack regression towards pictures, for example, the dream, "Autodidasker, conversation with the court counselor N," presents the same processes of displacement and condensation as the others. Hence, we cannot refuse to acknowledge that the two kinds of essentially different psychic processes participate in the formation of the dream. One forms perfectly correct dream thoughts which are equivalent to normal thoughts, while the other treats these ideas in a highly surprising and incorrect manner. The latter process we have already set apart as the dream work proper. What have we now to advance concerning this latter psychic process? We should be unable to answer this question here if we had not penetrated considerably into the psychology of the neuroses and especially of hysteria. From this we learn that the same incorrect psychic process, as well as others that have not been enumerated, control the formation of hysterical symptoms. In hysteria, too, we at once find a series of perfectly correct thoughts equivalent to our conscious thoughts, of whose existence, however, in this form we can learn nothing, and which we can only subsequently reconstruct. If they have forced their way anywhere to our perception, we discover from the analysis of the symptom form that these normal thoughts have been subjected to abnormal treatment and have been transformed into the symptom by means of condensation and compromise formation, through superficial associations, under cover of contradictions, and eventually over the road of regression. In view of the complete identity found between the peculiarities of the dream work and the psychic activity forming the psychoneurotic symptoms, we shall feel justified in transferring to the dream the conclusions urged upon us by hysteria. From the theory of hysteria, we borrowed the proposition that such an abnormal psychic elaboration of a normal train of thought takes place only when the latter has been used for the transference of an unconscious wish which dates from the infantile life and is in a state of repression. In accordance with this proposition, we have constructed the theory of the dream on the assumption that the actual dream wish invariably originates in the unconscious, which, as we ourselves have admitted, cannot be universally demonstrated, though it cannot be refuted. But in order to explain the real meaning of the term repression, which we have employed so freely, we shall be obliged to make some further addition to our psychological construction. We have above elaborated the fiction of a primitive psychic apparatus, whose work is regulated by the efforts to avoid accumulation of excitement and as far as possible to maintain itself free from excitement. For this reason it was constructed after the plan of a reflex apparatus. The motility, originally the path for the inner bodily change, formed a discharging path standing at its disposal. We subsequently discussed the psychic results of a feeling of gratification, and we might at the same time have introduced the second assumption, that is, that accumulation of excitement, following certain modalities that do not concern us, is perceived as pain and sets the apparatus in motion in order to reproduce a feeling of gratification in which the diminution of the excitement is perceived as pleasure. Such a current in the apparatus which emanates from pain and strives for pleasure we call a wish. We have said that nothing but a wish is capable of setting the apparatus in motion, and that the discharge of excitement in the apparatus is regulated automatically by the perception of pleasure and pain. The first wish must have been a hallucinatory occupation of the memory for gratification, but this hallucination, unless it were maintained to the point of exhaustion, proved incapable of bringing about a cessation of the desire and consequently of securing the pleasure connected with gratification. Thus there was required a second activity, in our terminology the activity of a second system, which should not permit the memory occupation to advance to perception, and therefrom to restrict the psychic forces, but should lead the excitement emanating from the craving stimulus by a devious path over the spontaneous motility which ultimately should so change the outer world as to allow the real perception of the object of gratification to take place. Thus far we have elaborated the plan of the psychic apparatus. These two systems are the germ of the unc for unconscious and forec for foreconscious, which we include in the fully developed apparatus. In order to be in a position successfully to change the outer world through the motility, there is required the accumulation of a large sum of experiences in the memory systems, as well as a manifold fixation of the relations which are evolved in this memory material by different end presentations. We now proceed further with our assumption. The manifold activity of the second system, tentatively sending forth and retracting energy, must on the one hand have full command over all memory material, but on the other hand it would be a superfluous expenditure for it to send through the individual mental paths large quantities of energy which would thus flow off to no purpose, diminishing the quantity available for the transformation of the outer world. In the interests of expediency, I therefore postulate that the second system succeeds in maintaining the greater part of the occupation energy in a dormant state, and in using but a small portion for the purposes of displacement. The mechanism of these processes is entirely unknown to me. Anyone who wishes to follow up these ideas must try to find the physical analogies and prepare the way for a demonstration of the process of motion in the stimulation of the neuron. I merely hold to the idea that the activity of the first psi system is directed to the free outflow of the quantities of excitement, and that the second system brings about an inhibition of this outflow through the energies emanating from it. That is, it produces a transformation into dormant energy, probably by raising the level. I therefore assume that under the control of the second system, as compared with the first, the course of the excitement is bound to entirely different mechanical conditions. After the second system has finished its tentative mental work, it removes the inhibition and congestion of the excitements and allows these excitements to flow off to the motility. An interesting train of thought now presents itself if we consider the relations of this inhibition of discharge by the second system to the regulation through the principle of pain. Let us now seek the counterpart of the primary feeling of gratification, namely, the objective feeling of fear. A perceptive stimulus acts on the primitive apparatus, becoming the source of a painful emotion. This will then be followed by irregular motor manifestations until one of these withdraws the apparatus from perception and at the same time from pain. But on the reappearance of the perception, this manifestation will immediately repeat itself, perhaps as a movement of flight, until the perception has again disappeared. But there will here remain no tendency again to occupy the perception of the source of pain in the form of a hallucination or in any other form. On the contrary, there will be a tendency in the primitive apparatus to abandon the painful memory picture as soon as it is in any way wakened, as the overflow of its excitement would surely produce, more precisely, begin to produce, pain. The deviation from memory, which is but a repetition of the formal flight from perception, is facilitated also by the fact that, unlike perception, memory does not possess sufficient quality to excite consciousness and thereby to attract to itself new energy. This easy and regularly occurring deviation of the psychic process from the former painful memory presents to us the model and the first example of psychic repression. As is generally known, much of this deviation from the painful, much of the behavior of the ostrich, can readily be demonstrated even in the normal psychic life of adults. By virtue of the principle of pain, the first system is therefore altogether incapable of introducing anything unpleasant into the mental associations. The system cannot do anything but wish. If this remains so, the mental activity of the second system, which should have at its disposal all the memories stored up by experiences, would be hindered. But two ways are now opened. The work of the second system either frees itself completely from the principle of pain and continues its course, paying no heed to the painful reminiscence, or it contrives to occupy the painful memory in such a manner as to preclude the liberation of pain. We may reject the first possibility, as the principle of pain also manifests itself as a regulator for the emotional discharge of the second system. We are, therefore, directed to the second possibility, namely, that this system occupies a reminiscence in such a manner as to inhibit its discharge, and hence, also, to inhibit the discharge comparable to a motor innervation for the development of pain. Thus, from two starting points, we are led to the hypothesis that occupation through the second system is at the same time an inhibition for the emotional discharge. That is, from a consideration of the principle of pain, and from the principle of the smallest expenditure of innervation. Let us, however, keep to the fact, this is the key to the theory of repression, that the second system is capable of occupying an idea only when it is positioned to check the development of pain emanating from it. Whatever withdraws itself from this inhibition also remains inaccessible for the second system, and would soon be abandoned by virtue of the principle of pain. The inhibition of pain, however, need not be complete. It must be permitted to begin, as it indicates to the second system the nature of memory and possibly its defective adaptation for the purpose sought by the mind. The psychic process which is admitted by the first system only I shall now call the primary process, and the one resulting from the inhibition of the second system I shall call the secondary process. I show by another point for what principle the second system is obliged to correct the primary process. The primary process strives for a discharge of the excitement in order to establish a perception identity with the sum of excitement thus gathered. The secondary process has abandoned this intention and undertaken instead the task of bringing about a thought identity. All thinking is only a circuitous path from the memory of gratification taken as an end presentation to the identical occupation of the same memory, which is again to be attained on the track of the motor experiences. The state of thinking must take an interest in the connecting paths between the presentations without allowing itself to be misled by their intensities. But it is obvious that the condensations and intermediate or compromised formations occurring in the presentations impede the attainment of this end identity. By substituting one idea for the other, they deviate from the path which otherwise would have been continued from the original idea. Such processes are therefore carefully avoided in the secondary thinking. Nor is it difficult to understand that the principle of pain also impedes the progress of the mental stream in its pursuit of the thought identity, though, indeed, it offers to the mental stream the most important points of departure. Hence, the tendency of the thinking process must be to free itself more and more from exclusive adjustment by the principle of pain, and through the working of the mind, to restrict the effective development to that minimum which is necessary as a signal. This refinement of the activity must have been attained through a recent overoccupation of energy brought about by consciousness. But we are aware that this refinement is seldom completely successful, even in the most normal psychic life, and that our thoughts ever remain accessible to falsification through the interference of the principle of pain. This, however, is not the breach in the functional efficiency of our psychic apparatus through which the thoughts forming the material of the secondary mental work are enabled to make their way to the primary psychic process, with which formula we may now describe the work leading to the dream and to the hysterical symptoms. This case of insufficiency results from the union of the two factors from the history of our evolution, one of which belongs solely to the psychic apparatus and has exerted a determining influence on the relation of the two systems, while the other operates fluctuatingly and introduces motive forces of organic origin into the psychic life. Both originate in the infantile life and result from the transformation which our psychic and somatic organism has undergone since the infantile period. When I termed one of the psychic processes in the psychic apparatus the primary process, I did so not only in consideration of the order of precedence and capability, but also as admitting the temporal relations to a share in the nomenclature. As far as our knowledge goes, there is no psychic apparatus possessing only the primary process, and in so far it is a theoretical fiction, but so much is based on the fact that the primary processes are present in the apparatus from the beginning, while the secondary processes develop gradually in the course of life, inhibiting and covering the primary ones, and gaining complete mastery over them perhaps only at the height of life. Owing to this retarded appearance of the secondary processes, the essence of our being, consisting in unconscious wish feelings, can neither be seized nor inhibited by the foreconscious, whose part is once and for all restricted to the indication of the most suitable paths for the wish feelings originating in the unconscious. These unconscious wishes establish for all subsequent psychic efforts a compulsion to which they have to submit, and which they must strive if possible to divert from its course and direct to higher aims. In consequence of this retardation of the foreconscious occupation, a large sphere of the memory material remains inaccessible. Among these indestructible and unencumbered wish feelings originating from the infantile life, there are also some, the fulfillments of which have entered into a relation of contradiction to the end presentation of the secondary thinking. The fulfillment of these wishes would no longer produce an effect of pleasure, but one of pain. And it is just this transformation of affect that constitutes the nature of what we designate as "repression," in which we recognize the infantile first step of passing adverse sentence or of rejecting through reason. To investigate in what way and through what motive forces such a transformation can be produced constitutes the problem of repression, which we need here only skim over. It will suffice to remark
that such a transformation of affect occurs in the course of development (parens), one may think of the appearance in infantile life of disgust which was originally absent (close parens), and that is connected with the activity of the secondary system. The memories from which the unconscious wish brings about the emotional discharge have never been accessible to the forec, and for that reason their emotional discharge cannot be inhibited. It is just on account of this affective development that these ideas are not even now accessible to the foreconscious thoughts to which they have transferred their wishing power. On the contrary, the principle of pain comes into play and causes the forec to deviate from these thoughts of transference. The latter, left to themselves, are "repressed," and thus the existence of a store of infantile memories, from the very beginning withdrawn from the forec, become the preliminary condition of repression. In the most favorable case, the development of pain terminates as soon as the energy has been withdrawn from the thoughts of transference in the forec, and this effect characterizes the intervention of the principle of pain as expedient. It is different, however, if the repressed unconscious wish receives an organic enforcement which it can lend its thoughts of transference, and through which it can enable them to make an effort towards penetration with their excitement even after they have been abandoned by the occupation of the forec. A defensive struggle then ensues, inasmuch as the forec reinforces the antagonism against the repressed ideas, and subsequently this leads to a penetration by the thoughts of transference (the carriers of the unconscious wish) in some form of compromise through symptom formation. But from the moment that the suppressed thoughts are powerfully occupied by the unconscious wish feeling and abandoned by the foreconscious occupation, they succumb to the primary psychic process and strive only for motor discharge, or, if the path be free, for hallucinatory revival of the desired perception identity. We have previously found empirically that the incorrect processes described are enacted only with thoughts that exist in the repression. We now grasp another part of the connection. These incorrect processes are those that are primary in the psychic apparatus. They appear wherever thoughts abandoned by the foreconscious occupation are left to themselves, and can fill themselves with the uninhibited energy striving for discharge from the unconscious. We may add a few further observations to support the view that these processes designated "incorrect" are really not falsifications of the normal defective thinking, but the modes of activity of the psychic apparatus when freed from inhibition. Thus we see that the transference of the foreconscious excitement to the motility takes place according to the same processes, and that the connection of the foreconscious presentation with words readily manifests the same displacements and mixtures which are ascribed to inattention. Finally, I should like to adduce proof that an increase of work necessarily results from the inhibition of these primary courses from the fact that we gain a comical effect, a surplus to be discharged through laughter, if we allow these streams of thought to come to consciousness. The theory of the psychoneuroses asserts with complete certainty that only sexual wish feelings from the infantile life experience repression (emotional transformation) during the developmental period of childhood. These are capable of returning to activity at a later period of development, and then have the faculty of being revived, either as a consequence of the sexual constitution, which is really formed from the original bisexuality, or in consequence of unfavorable influences of the sexual life, and they thus supply the motive power for all psychoneurotic symptom formations. It is only by the introduction of these sexual forces that the gap still demonstrable in the theory of repression can be filled. I will leave it undecided whether the postulate of the sexual and infantile may also be asserted for the theory of the dream. I leave this here unfinished because I have already passed a step beyond the demonstrable in assuming that the dream wish invariably originates from the unconscious. Footnote: Here, as in other places, there are gaps in the treatment of the subject which I have left intentionally, because to fill them up would require on the one hand too great effort, and on the other hand an extensive reference to material that is foreign to the dream. Thus I have avoided stating whether I connect the word suppressed another sense with the word repressed. It has been made clear only that the latter emphasizes more than the former the relation to the unconscious. I have not entered into the cognate problem why the dream thoughts also experience distortion by the sensor when they abandon the progressive continuation to consciousness and choose the path of regression. I have been above all anxious to awaken an interest in the problems to which the further analysis of the dream work leads, and indicate the other themes which meet these on the way. It was not always easy to decide just where the pursuit should be discontinued. That I have not treated exhaustively the part played in the dream by the psychosexual life, and have avoided the interpretation of dreams of an obvious sexual content, is due to a special reason which may not come up to the reader's expectation. To be sure, it is very far from my ideas and the principles expressed by me in neuropathology to regard the sexual life as pudendum, which should be left unconsidered by the physician and the scientific investigator. I also consider ludicrous the moral indignation which prompted the translator of Artemius of Daedalus to keep from the reader's knowledge the chapter on sexual dreams contained in the symbolism of the dreams. As for myself, I have been actuated solely by the conviction that the explanation of sexual dreams I should be bound to entangle myself deeply in the still unexplained problems of perversion and bisexuality, and for that reason I have reserved this material for another connection. End footnote. Nor will I further investigate the difference in the play of the psychic forces in the dream formation and in the formation of the hysterical symptoms. For to do this we ought to possess a more explicit knowledge of one of the members to be compared. But I regard another point as important, and will here confess that it was on account of this very point that I have just undertaken this entire discussion concerning the two psychic systems, their modes of operation, and the repression. For it is now immaterial whether I have conceived the psychological relation in question with the approximate correctness, or, as is easily possible in such a difficult matter, in an erroneous and fragmentary manner. Whatever changes may be made in the interpretation of the psychic censor, and of the correct and of the abnormal elaboration of the dream content, the fact nevertheless remains that such processes are active in dream formation, and that essentially they show the closest analogy to the processes observed in the formation of the hysterical symptoms. The dream is not a pathological phenomenon, and it does not leave behind an enfeeblement of the mental faculties. The objection that no deduction can be drawn regarding the dreams of healthy persons from my own dreams and from those of neurotic patients may be rejected without comment. Hence, when we draw conclusions from the phenomena as to their motive forces, we recognize that the psychic mechanism made use of by the neuroses is not created by a morbid disturbance of the psychic life, but is found ready in the normal structure of the psychic apparatus. The two psychic systems, the censor crossing between them, the inhibition and the covering of one activity by the other, the relationships of both to consciousness, or whatever may offer a more correct interpretation of the actual conditions in their stead, all these belong to the normal structure of our psychic instrument, and the dream points out for us one of the roads leading to knowledge of this structure. If, in addition to our knowledge, we wish to be contented with a minimum perfectly established, we shall say that the dream gives us proof that the suppressed material continues to exist even in the normal person and remains capable of psychic activity. The dream itself is one of the manifestations of the suppressed material. Theoretically, this is true in all cases. According to substantial experience, it is true in at least a great number of such, as most conspicuously display the prominent characteristics of dream life. The suppressed psychic material, which in the waking state has been prevented from expression and cut off from internal perception by the antagonistic adjustment of the contradictions, finds ways and means of obtruding itself on consciousness during the night under domination of the compromised formations. Flectus sine nequis superis accenerantem movebo. At any rate, the interpretation of dreams is the via regia to a knowledge of the unconscious in the psychic life. In following the analysis of the dream, we have made some progress towards an understanding of the composition of this most marvelous and most mysterious of instruments. To be sure, we have not gone very far, but enough of a beginning has been made to allow us to advance from other so-called pathological formations further into the analysis of the unconscious. Disease, at least that which is justly termed functional, is not due to the destruction of this apparatus and the establishment of new splittings in its interior. It is rather to be explained dynamically through the strengthening and weakening of the components and the play of forces by which so many activities are concealed during the normal function. We have been able to show in another place how the composition of the apparatus from the two systems permits a subtilization even of the normal activity which would be impossible for a single system. End of section 8. The primary and secondary process, regression.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Dream Psychology by Sigmund Freud, translated by M.D. Eder, Chapter 9, The Unconscious and Consciousness, Reality. On closer inspection, we find that it is not the existence of two systems near the motor end of the apparatus, but of two kinds of processes or modes of emotional discharge, the assumption of which was explained in the psychological discussions of the previous chapter. This can make no difference for us, for we must always be ready to drop our auxiliary ideas whenever we deem ourselves in a position to replace them by something else approaching more closely to the unknown reality. Let us now try to correct some views which might be erroneously formed as long as we regarded the two systems, in the crudest and most obvious sense, as two localities within the psychic apparatus, views which have left their traces in the terms "repression" and "penetration." Thus, when we say that an unconscious idea strives for transference into the foreconscious in order later to penetrate consciousness, we do not mean that a second idea is to be formed situated in a new locality, like an interlineation near which the original continues to remain. Also, when we speak of penetration into consciousness, we wish carefully to avoid any idea of change of locality. When we say that a foreconscious idea is repressed and subsequently taken up by the unconscious, we might be tempted by these figures, borrowed from the idea of a struggle over a territory, to assume that an arrangement is really broken up in one psychic locality and replaced by a new one in the other locality. For these comparisons, we substitute what would seem to correspond better with the real state of affairs by saying that an energy occupation is displaced to, or withdrawn from, a certain arrangement, so that the psychic formation falls under the domination of a system or is withdrawn from the same. Here again, we replace a topical mode of presentation by a dynamic. It is not the psychic formation that appears to us as the moving factor, but the innervation of the same. I deem it appropriate and justifiable, however, to apply ourselves still further to the illustrative conception of the two systems. We shall avoid any misapplication of this manner of representation if we remember that presentations, thoughts, and psychic formations should generally not be localized in the organic elements of the nervous system, but, so to speak, between them, where resistances and paths form the correlate corresponding to them. Everything that can become an object of our internal perception is virtual, like the image in a telescope produced by the passage of the rays of light. But we are justified in assuming the existence of the systems, which have nothing psychic in themselves and which never become accessible to our psychic perception, corresponding to the lenses of the telescope which design the image. If we continue this comparison, we may say that the sensor between two systems corresponds to the refraction of rays during their passage into a new medium. Thus far, we have made psychology on our own responsibility. It is now time to examine the theoretical opinions governing present-day psychology and to test the relation to our theories. The question of the unconscious in psychology is, according to authoritative words of lips, less a psychological question than the question of psychology. As long as psychology settled this question with the verbal explanation that the quote psychic is the quote conscience, and that the quote unconscious psychic occurrences end quote are an obvious contradiction, a psychological estimate of the observations gained by the physician from abnormal mental states was precluded. The physician and the philosopher agree only when both acknowledge that the unconscious psychic processes are, quote, the appropriate and well-justified expression for an established fact, end quote. The physician cannot but reject with a shrug of his shoulders the assertion that, quote, consciousness is the indispensable quality of the psychic, end quote. He may assume, if his respect for the utterings of the philosopher still be strong enough, that he and they do not treat the same subject and do not pursue the same science. For a single intelligent observation of the psychic life of a neurotic, a single analysis of a dream must force upon him the unalterable conviction that the most complicated and correct mental operations, to which no one will refuse the name of psychic occurrences, may take place without exciting the consciousness of the person. It is true that the physician does not learn of these unconscious processes until they have exerted such an effect on consciousness as to admit communication or observation. But this effect of consciousness may show a psychic character wildly differing from the unconscious processes, so that the internal perception cannot possibly recognize the one as a substitute for the other. The physician must reserve for himself the right to penetrate, by a process of deduction, from the effect on consciousness to the unconscious psychic processes. He learns in this way that the effect on consciousness is only a remote psychic product of the unconscious process, and that the latter has not become conscious as such, that it has been in existence and operative without betraying itself in any way to consciousness. A reaction from the overestimation of the quality of consciousness becomes the indispensable preliminary condition for any correct insight into the behavior of the psychic. In the words of lips, the unconscious must be accepted as the general basis of the psychic life. The unconscious is the larger circle which includes within itself the smaller circle of the conscious. Everything conscious has its preliminary step in the unconscious, whereas the unconscious may stop with this step and still claim full value as a psychic activity. Properly speaking, the unconscious is the real psychic. Its inner nature is just as unknown to us as the reality of the external world, and it is just as imperfectly reported to us through the data of consciousness as is the external world through the indication of our sensory organs. A series of dream problems which have intensely occupied older authors will be laid aside when the old opposition between conscious life and dream life is abandoned and the unconscious psychic assigned to its proper place. Thus, many of the activities whose performances in the dream have excited our admiration are now no longer to be attributed to the dream, but to unconscious thinking, which is also active during the day. If, according to Schneerer, the dream seems to play with a symboling representation of the body, we know that this is the work of certain unconscious fantasies, which have probably given in to sexual emotions, and that these fantasies come to expression not only in dreams, but also in hysterical phobias and in other symptoms. If the dream continues and settles activities of the day, and even brings to light valuable inspirations, We have only to subtract from it the dream disguise as a feat of dream work, and a mark of assistance from obscure forces in the depth of the mind (cf. the devil in Tartini's Sonata Dream). The intellectual task, as such, must be attributed to the same psychic forces which perform all such tasks during the day. We are probably far too much inclined to overestimate the conscious character even of intellectual and artistic productions. From the communications of some of the most highly productive persons, such as Goethe and Helmholtz, we learn indeed that the most essential and original parts in their creations came to them in the form of inspirations, and reached their perceptions almost finished. There is nothing strange about the assistance of the conscious activity in other cases where there was a concerted effort of all the psychic forces. But it is a much abused privilege of the conscious activity that is allowed to hide from us all other activities wherever it participates. It will hardly be worthwhile to take up the historical significance of dreams as a special subject. Where, for instance, a chieftain has been urged through a dream to engage in a bold undertaking, the success of which has had the effect of changing history. A new problem results only so long as the dream, regarded as a strange power, is contrasted with the other more familiar psychic forces. The problem, however, disappears when we regard the dream as a form of expression for feelings which are burdened with resistance during the day and which can receive reinforcements at night from deep emotional sources. But the great respect shown by the ancients for the dream is based on a correct psychological surmise. It is an homage paid to the unsubdued and indestructible in the human mind, and to the demoniacal which furnishes the dream wish and which we find again in our unconscious. Not inadvisedly do I use the expression, "in our unconscious," for what we so designate does not coincide with the unconscious of the philosophers, nor with the unconscious of Lipps. In the latter uses it is intended to designate only the opposite of conscious. That there are also unconscious psychic processes beside the conscious ones is the hotly contested and energetically defended issue. Lipps gives us the more far-reaching theory that everything psychic exists as unconscious, but that some of it may exist also as conscious. But it was not to prove this theory that we have adduced the phenomena of the dream and of the hysterical symptom formation. The observation of normal life alone suffices to establish its correctness beyond any doubt. The new fact that we have learned from the analysis of the psychopathological formations, and indeed from their first member, that is dreams, is that the unconscious, hence the psychic, occurs as a function of two separate systems, and that it occurs as such even in normal psychic life. Consequently, there are two kinds of unconscious, which we do not as yet find distinguished by the psychologist. Both are unconscious in the psychological sense, but in our sense the first, which we call unsee, is likewise incapable of consciousness, whereas the second we term foresee, because its emotions, after the observance of certain rules, can reach consciousness, perhaps not before they have again undergone censorship, but still regardless of the unsee system. The fact that in order to attain consciousness the emotions must traverse an unalterable series of events or succession of instances, as is betrayed through their alteration by the censor, has helped us to draw a comparison from spatiality. We describe the relations of the two systems to each other and to consciousness by saying that the system foresee is like a screen between the system unsee and consciousness. The system foresee not only bars access to consciousness, but also controls the entrance to voluntary motility and is capable of sending out a sum of mobile energy, a portion of which is familiar to us as attention. We must also steer clear of the distinctions superconscious and subconscious, which have found so much favor in the more recent literature on the psychoneuroses. For just such a distinction seems to emphasize the equivalence of the psychic and the conscious. What part now remains in our description of the once all-powerful and all-overshadowing consciousness? None other than that of a sensory organ for the perception of psychic qualities. According to the fundamental idea of schematic undertaking, we can conceive the conscious perception only as the particular activity of an independent system, for which the abbreviated designation cons commends itself. The system we conceive to be similar in its mechanical characteristics to the perception system P, hence excitable by qualities, and incapable of retaining the trace of changes, that is, it is devoid of memory. The psychic apparatus which, with the sensory organ of the P system, is turned to the outer world, is itself the outer world for the sensory organ of cons, the teleological justification of which rests on this relationship. We are here once more confronted with the principle of the succession of instances which seems to dominate the structure of the apparatus. The material under excitement flows to the cons, sensory organ from the two sides, firstly from the P system, whose excitement, qualitatively determined, probably experiences a new elaboration until it comes to conscious perception, and, secondly, from the interior of the apparatus itself, the quantitative processes of which are perceived as qualitative series of pleasure and pain as soon as they have undergone certain changes. The philosophers, who have learned that correct and highly complicated thought structures are possible even without the cooperation of consciousness, have found it difficult to attribute any function to consciousness. It has appeared to them a superfluous mirroring of the perfected psychic process. The analogy of our con system with the systems of perception relieves us of this embarrassment. We see that perception through our sensory organs results in directing the occupation of attention to those paths on which the incoming sensory excitement is diffused. The qualitative excitement of the P system serves the mobile quantity of the psychic apparatus as a regulator for its discharge. We may claim the same function for the overlying sensory organ of the con system. By assuming new qualities, it furnishes a new contribution towards the guidance and suitable distribution of the mobile occupation quantities. By means of the perception of pleasure and pain, it influences the course of the occupations within the psychic apparatus, which normally operates unconsciously and through the displacement of quantities. It is probable that the principle of pain first regulates displacements of occupation automatically, but it is quite possible that the consciousness of these qualities adds a second and more subtle regulation, which may even oppose the first and perfect the working capacity of the apparatus by placing it in the position contrary to its original design for occupying and developing even that which is connected with the liberation of pain. We learn from neuropsychology that an important part of the functional activity of the apparatus is attributed to such regulations through the qualitative excitation of the sensory organs. The automatic control of the primary principle of pain and the restrictions of mental capacity connected with it are broken by the sensible regulations, which in their turn are again automatisms. We learn that the repression which, though originally expedient, terminates nevertheless in a harmful rejection of inhibition and of psychic domination, is so much more easily accomplished with reminiscences than with perceptions, because the former there is no increase in occupation through the excitement of the psychic sensory organs. When an idea to be rejected has once failed to become conscious because it has succumbed to repression, it can be repressed on other occasions only because it has been withdrawn from conscious perception on other grounds. These are hints employed by therapy in order to bring about a retrogression of accomplished repressions. The value of the overoccupation which is produced by the regulating influence of the cons sensory organ on the mobile quantity, is demonstrated in the teleological connection by nothing more clearly than by the creation of a new series of qualities, and consequently a new regulation, which constitutes the precedence of man over the animals. For the mental processes are in themselves devoid of quality, except for the excitements of pleasure and pain accompanying them, which, as we know, are to be held in check as possible disturbances of thought. In order to endow them with a quality, they are associated in man with verbal memories, the qualitative remnants of which suffice to draw upon them the attention of consciousness, which in turn endows thought with a new mobile energy. The manifold problems of consciousness in their entirety can be examined only through an analysis of the hysterical mental processes. From this analysis, we receive the impression that the transition from the foreconscious to the occupation of consciousness is also connected with a censorship similar to the one between the unsee and the foresee. This censorship, too, begins to act only with the reaching of a certain quantitative degree, so that few intense thought formations escape it. Every possible case of detention from consciousness, as well as of a penetration to consciousness under restriction, is found included within the picture of the psychoneurotic phenomena. Every case points to the intimate and twofold connection between the censor and consciousness. I shall conclude these psychological discussions with the report of two such occurrences. On the occasion of a consultation a few years ago, the subject was an intelligent and innocent-looking girl. Her attire was strange. Whereas a woman's garb is usually groomed to the last fold, she had one of her stockings hanging down and two of her waist buttons opened. She complained of pains in one of her legs and exposed her leg unrequested. Her chief complaint, however, was in her own words as follows: she had a feeling in her body as if something was stuck into it, which moved to and fro and made her tremble through and through. This sometimes made her whole body stiff. On hearing this, my colleague in consultation looked at me. The complaint was quite plain to him. To both of us it seemed peculiar that the patient's mother thought nothing of the matter. Of course, she herself must have been repeatedly in the situation described by her child. As for the girl, she had no idea of the import of her words, or she would never have allowed them to pass her lips. Here the censor had been deceived so successfully that under the mask of an innocent complaint, a fantasy was admitted to consciousness which otherwise would have remained in the foreconscious. Another example. I began the psychoanalytic treatment of a boy of 14 years who was suffering from tic convulsif, hysterical vomiting, headache, etc., by assuring him that, after closing his eyes, he would see pictures or have ideas, which I requested him to communicate to me. He answered by describing pictures. The last impression he had received before coming to me was visually revived in his memory. He had played a game of checkers with his uncle, and now saw the checkerboard before him. He commented on various positions that were favorable or unfavorable, on the moves that were not safe to make. He then saw a dagger lying on the checkerboard, an object belonging to his father, but transferred to the checkerboard by his fantasy. Then a sickle was lying on the board. Next a scythe was added, and finally he beheld the likeness of an old peasant mowing the grass in front of the boy's distant parental home. A few days later, I discovered the meaning of this series of pictures. Disagreeable family relations had made the boy nervous. It was the case of a strict and crabbed father who lived unhappily with his mother, and whose educational methods consisted in threats, of the separation of his father from his tender and delicate mother, and the remarrying of his father, who one day brought home a young woman as his new mamma. The illness of the 14-year-old boy broke out a few days later.
It was the suppressed anger against his father that had composed these pictures into intelligible illusions. The material was furnished by a reminiscence from mythology. The sickle was the one with which Zeus castrated his father. The scythe and the likeness of the peasant represented Kronos, the violent old man who eats his children, and upon whom Zeus wreaks vengeance in so unfilial a manner. The marriage of the father gave the boy an opportunity to return the reproaches and threats of his father, which had previously been made because the child played with his genitals (the checkerboard, the prohibited moves, the dagger with which a person may be killed). We have here long repressed memories and their unconscious remnants which, under the guise of senseless pictures, have slipped into consciousness by devious paths left open to them. I should then expect to find the theoretical value of the study of dreams in its contributions to psychological knowledge and in its preparation for an understanding of neuroses. Who can foresee the importance of a thorough knowledge of the structure and activities of the psychic apparatus when even our present state of knowledge produces a happy therapeutic influence in the curable forms of the psychoneuroses? What about the practical value of such study, someone may ask, for psychic knowledge and for the discovering of the secret peculiarities of individual character? Have not the unconscious feelings revealed by the dream the value of real forces in the psychic life? Should we take lightly the ethical significance of the suppressed wishes which, as they now create dreams, may some day create other things? I do not feel justified in answering these questions. I have not thought further upon this side of the dream problem. I believe, however, that at all events the Roman emperor was in the wrong who ordered one of his subjects executed because the latter dreamt that he had killed the emperor. He should first have endeavored to discover the significance of the dream. Most probably it was not what it seemed to be. And even if a dream of different content had the significance of this offense against majesty, it would still have been in place to remember the words of Plato, that the virtuous man contents himself with dreaming that which the wicked man does in actual life. I am therefore of the opinion that it is best to accord freedom to dreams. Whether any reality is to be attributed to the unconscious wishes, and in what sense, I am not prepared to say offhand. Reality must naturally be denied to all transition and intermediate thoughts. If we had before us the unconscious wishes, brought to their last and truest expression, we should still do well to remember that more than one single form of existence must be ascribed to the psychic reality. Action and the conscious expression of thought mostly suffice for the practical need of judging a man's character. Action, above all, merits to be placed in the first rank, for many of the impulses penetrating consciousness are neutralized by real forces of the psychic life before they are converted into action. Indeed, the reason why they frequently do not encounter any psychic obstacle on their way is because the unconscious is certain of their meeting with resistances later. In any case, it is instructive to become familiar with the much raked up soil from which our virtues proudly arise. For the complication of human character moving dynamically in all directions very rarely accommodates itself to adjustment through a simple alternative, as our antiquated moral philosophy would have it. And how about the value of the dream for knowledge of the future? That, of course, we cannot consider. One feels inclined to substitute, for a knowledge of the past, for the dream originates from the past in every sense. To be sure, the ancient belief that the dream reveals the future is not entirely devoid of truth. By representing to us a wish as fulfilled, the dream certainly leads us into the future. But this future, taken by the dreamer as present, has been formed into the likeness of that past by the indestructible wish. End of Chapter 9, The Unconscious and Consciousness, Reality. End of Dream Psychology by Sigmund Freud. Translated by M.D. Eder.